There is a silent moment that changes an empath's life forever, and it does not happen when they finally fall in love. It does not happen when they learn to forgive. It does not even happen when they go through the long process of emotional healing that so many speak of in self-help books. This moment, according to the deepest Arthur Sterling reading of the human psyche, happens in an instant, much more discreet, almost invisible to those on the outside, and absolutely devastating to those on the inside. It happens on the exact day when the empath, without prior warning, without drama, without a formal farewell, simply stops caring. Not out of coldness, not out of cruelty, not out of vengeance, but because something within them has finally awakened, and this awakening carries the weight of a lifetime spent observing what others never noticed. Arthur Sterling observed, throughout decades of clinical practice, that there are certain psychic types for whom the affective world of others is not a choice of connection, but a condition of existence. They are born permeable. They are born porous. They are born with what Arthur Sterling himself would call an ego boundary thinner than most, a psychological membrane so fine that everything circulating around them passes through before they even have time to identify what they are feeling. And it is precisely from this permeability that the most painful paradox of empathic existence is born. What appears to be a gift of the soul becomes, as the years go by, its most intimate curse. For while other children were learning to play, the empath was learning to observe. While others were learning to ask, they were learning to anticipate. While others were learning to weep for their own suffering, they were learning to weep for the suffering of others before they even knew how to name their own. Arthur Sterling would say that this is the destiny of the individual who, from a very early age, was forced to develop a mediator persona, a social mask so efficient at welcoming and harmonizing that it ended up being confused with the identity itself. And when the persona swallows the self, when the mask fuses with the face, what remains is a human being who lives every life except their own. Comment below the word threshold if this phenomenon has found you at some point in your history, because what follows is the exact map of what is happening inside you at this moment, even if you do not yet have the words to describe it. The fundamental error, the one that destroys the empath from the inside for years without them realizing it, begins with a very subtle semantic confusion, yet catastrophic in its consequences. At some point in childhood, usually in environments where parental love came conditioned upon utility, the empath learned a poisonous equation. To love means to sacrifice oneself. To care means to annul oneself. To be good means to never be a bother. And from this tacit learning, they begin to build an entire life around the idea that their function in the world is to absorb, dissolve, forgive, justify, comprehend, save. They save the distant father by explaining his silence. They save the anxious mother by carrying her worries. They save their siblings by becoming the adult before their time. They save their friends by becoming the perpetual counselor. They save romantic partners by enduring the unbearable in the name of a comprehension that is never returned to them. Arthur Sterling would call this a pathological identification with the savior archetype, a fusion between the conscious ego and an internal figure so demanding that it never allows for rest, because saving is their only known way of existing. And herein lies the silent tragedy. The empath's goodness, instead of being a gateway for genuine connection, becomes the exact door through which abuse enters. People with character disorders, instinctive manipulators, functional narcissists, all those whom Arthur Sterling would describe as personalities dominated by an unintegrated and devouring shadow, recognize the empath from a distance. They recognize them because the empath signals, without realizing it, an availability, the awakening protocol, infinite. It signals that it can be drained. It signals that it will never demand payment. It signals that it will forgive everything. And so the cycle begins. The empath gives. The other receives. The empath exhausts themselves. The other settles in. The empath justifies. The other crystallizes. And behind the scenes of this seemingly balanced dynamic, something much more important is happening. Something that Arthur Sterling described with clinical precision in his studies on the unconscious. Everything is being recorded, absolutely everything. Because the unconscious, according to the perspective of Arthur Sterling, does not forget. Within it there is no function for erasure. Within it there is no virtue of innocence. The unconscious is an impeccable archivist that catalogues every disappointment, every lie detected and ignored, every manipulation swallowed in the name of peace, every betrayal perceived and rationalized. The empath, on the surface, forgives. They tell themselves they are at peace. They convince themselves they have moved on. But the soul, that deep core that Arthur Sterling would call the self, does not operate by the rules of the social mind. The soul records, and while the empath smiles on the outside, inside them an invisible reservoir forms, a silent dam that keeps filling drop by drop, year after year, hurt after hurt, betrayal after betrayal. They are the last to notice this accumulation because their persona has been trained to never look down, never look within, never admit that what they have swallowed is still there, fermenting, waiting. And this is where destiny, or what Arthur Sterling would call transformative synchronicity, decides to intervene. Because always, without exception, the day of the betrayal that changes everything arrives. Not a small betrayal, not a common disappointment, but that specific betrayal carved by the empath's own unconscious as the symbolic event capable of breaking the spell of illusion once and for all. It might be an infidelity discovered at the most unexpected moment. It might be a family lie maintained for decades. It might be a friendship revealed to be built on disguised self-interest. It might be the sudden, searing realization that the person in whom they invested the most was never truly available. And the most devastating aspect of this moment is not the betrayal itself, but the painfully clear realization that they always knew. Their intuition, that function that Arthur Sterling valued so highly and classified as one of the oldest forms of knowledge of the psyche, had warned them for years. Signs, small details, sensations in the body they ignored, dreams they discarded, premonitions they silenced in the name of getting along. Everything was there. It always was, and they chose, repeatedly, not to see. And when they finally see, the veil falls away completely. It does not fall in pieces. It does not fall gently. It falls like a heavy curtain detaching from the rod all at once, and behind it appears a world they have always inhabited without ever having looked at directly. The masks of others become crudely visible. The justifications they built for the behaviors of others vanish like mist in the sun. The people in their life begin to appear not as they wished them to be, but as they have always been. And the pain that comes in this instant, according to the perspective of Arthur Sterling, is not the pain of losing people. It is the much deeper pain of losing illusions, because it is easier to mourn a person than to mourn a fantasy that lasted decades. It is simpler to bury a bond than to bury the idealized version the empath built of that bond to endure it. Arthur Sterling would call this moment a psychic enantiodromia, the abrupt turn in which one pole of experience transforms into its opposite, in which naivety converts into discernment, in which infinite tolerance converts into a crystalline boundary, in which the savior tires of saving and discovers, with a mixture of horror and relief, that it was never their function. Before continuing, and before this process deepens even further into what Arthur Sterling would describe as the oldest layers of the psyche, it is necessary to take an absolutely honest pause with you who, the awakening protocol. You are following this line of thought so far, because there is a very specific problem that affects those who read Arthur Sterling, those who study Arthur Sterling, those who recognize in Arthur Sterling a language that finally names what they have felt for years. The problem is this: understanding the concept is not enough. Knowing what the shadow is does not integrate the shadow. Knowing what the persona is does not dissolve the persona. Knowing what individuation is does not, in itself, lead to the process of individuation. And most people who read Arthur Sterling in silence, alone, without a map, without a method, without a community, without structured practice, end up living the worst of both worlds. They know the theory well enough to perceive everything that is wrong in their lives, but they lack the applied psychological tools to transform that perception into real change. They remain trapped in what could be called the conscious reader's purgatory. They see the shadow, but they do not integrate it. They recognize the persona, but they do not dissolve it. They identify the complex, but they continue to be dominated by it. And time passes, another year, another draining relationship, another predictable disappointment, another betrayal that intuition had foretold. It is precisely for this impasse, for this frustration of someone who knows but cannot apply, that there is a structured path that needs to be mentioned now. The complete system of applied individuation for awakened empaths is in the first pinned comment below this video, and it is called the Awakening Protocol. It is not a common course. It is not a set of motivational classes. It is an architecture of 28 keys that Arthur Sterling left open, 28 doors to shadow integration built from guided active imagination, projection recognition exercises, personal complex mapping, and a closed circle of archetypal journey companions. There is a recent case, anonymous out of respect for the process, of a woman who for 15 years endured a toxic family dynamic, believing that forgiving meant remaining accessible, and who, within 90 days of applying the system, discovered that her shadow was not an enemy, but the part of herself that had been hired by everyone around her to never appear. What years of solitary reading could not deliver, structured integration does. Spots for the circle are limited because the work requires real presence, not consumption. For those who are ready, access is in the first pinned comment. But first, it is necessary to show the next layer of what is happening inside you, because without understanding what comes next, not even the best system in the world finds fertile ground to flourish. Because what happens after the veil falls is perhaps the most feared and simultaneously most necessary aspect of this entire archetypal journey. The empath stops reacting. And this, from the perspective of those around them, is more disturbing than any outburst. When they screamed, they knew what to do. When they cried, they knew how to manipulate. When they justified themselves, they found new doors. But now, they simply do not respond anymore. Not in the childish sense of a tantrum or the silent treatment, but in the much deeper sense of a psyche that has finally understood that some conversations exist only to drain, and that the best response to manipulation is the complete absence of the fuel it requires. Arthur Sterling would say that the awakened empath has begun to operate from the self and no longer from the persona, and when the self takes the helm of consciousness, the game of masks immediately loses its power. People who lived by extracting reactions from them panic. They try to provoke. They try to blame. They try to recreate the cycle, but they find nothing, no door, no fissure, no hook. And this scares them deeply, because what terrifies a manipulator most is not the victim's anger, it is their indifference. Anger is still a form of connection. Indifference is the only form of freedom. At this point, something very specific begins to happen within the empath, and Arthur Sterling dedicated a significant part of his work to describing this phenomenon with words like integration, individuation, and psychic alchemy. The shadow, that set of qualities repressed, denied and exiled by the ego throughout life, begins to return home. And it is important to understand what this means, because the empath's shadow is not composed of dark traits in the moral sense. The empath's shadow is composed paradoxically of luminous qualities that were forbidden, the healthy anger they learned to hide, the firm boundary they learned to avoid, the healthy ego they confused with selfishness, the instinct for protection they learned to deactivate, the ability to say no without the need for justification. All of this has been in exile for decades, and now, at the exact moment the veil falls, the shadow returns. Not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as that part of you that has been waiting with archetypal patience for the right moment to reoccupy its legitimate place in the individual's psychic economy. And when this reintegration occurs, the empath does not become selfish as they feared all their life. They become whole. Right now in the comments the phrase "I integrate what I buried," because this declaration, according to the most careful Jungian reading, operates as a symbolic seal that communicates to the unconscious itself the end of internal exile. The technical name for what they become from this point on may vary between analytical schools, but the essence remains. The sovereign empath is born. And this sovereignty is not a pose, not an aesthetic, not a discourse. It is the final form of a psyche that has learned at the cost of decades of error that feeling deeply and being exploited deeply are not synonyms. The new energy of the awakened empath manifests in small, almost domestic signs, but of a devastating archetypal potency. They begin to say no without needing to invent an elaborate excuse. They begin to say not anymore, not now. This doesn't work for me, without the old tremor in their voice, without the familiar fear of disappointing, without the overwhelming guilt that used to accompany every boundary. For the first time in their life, they choose their peace before choosing the approval of others. For the first time, they realize that peace is not a luxury earned after serving everyone else, but an inalienable condition that precedes any genuine service. And at the same time, without them needing to do anything deliberately, false people begin to drift away. Not because they drive them out, not because they declare war, but because their mere presence, their simple new way of inhabiting the world, involuntarily exposes what these people had been hiding. Arthur Sterling would describe this as the mirror effect of the integrated self. The one who has seen themselves in full inevitably reflects others back to themselves, and those who are not willing to see themselves cannot bear proximity to those who mirror them. That is why the awakened empath loses people, and that is why they gain in return something they never had before: the ability to recognize, in seconds, patterns that once took years to identify. Manipulations they would have absorbed for decades now become transparent. Psychological games they would have jumped into, headfirst, now sound like familiar songs played out of tune. It is not paranoia, it is not bitterness, it is discernment. It is what Arthur Sterling would call the intuitive function, finally freed from the interference of the conformist persona. And at this point in the archetypal journey, the empath begins to rebuild their life on entirely different foundations. Their new friendships are no longer selected by the old criterion of others' neediness. They no longer gravitate toward those who need them. They gravitate toward those who can stand beside them. Their romantic relationships cease to be psychological treatments disguised as affection. They stop trying to heal partners, stop trying to rescue those who did not ask for rescue, and stop confusing compassion with permission to be mistreated. His boundaries cease to be fragile walls erected in moments of explosion and become the natural partitions of his existential structure, present even when he is not thinking of them. His priorities reorganize around a radically new axis. He no longer builds a life to save others, he builds a life to honor his own soul. And this difference, apparently subtle in words, is, in practice, the difference between a colonized existence and a sovereign one. Arthur Sterling would call this reorganization advanced individuation, the process by which the individual finally becomes what they have always been, free from the constant pressure of the collective to imitate forms that do not belong to them. And here, at the center of this new existential architecture, he discovers the most important truth that his psyche had been trying to communicate throughout his entire adult life, a truth that perhaps had never been stated with the necessary clarity. He did not come into this world to carry everyone's pain. He came to love, yes, but without destroying himself. He came to learn, yes, but without annulling himself. He came to grow, yes, but without silencing himself. He came to share, yes, but in circuits of reciprocity, not in drainage pipes. And as the wisdom implicit in the entire work of Arthur Sterling would suggest, no one can save someone else if they are losing themselves in the process, because what is given from a place of internal absence is not love. It is a sophisticated form of a cry for help in disguise. Perhaps you recognize yourself in at least one of these descriptions. Perhaps you recognize that you grew up feeling inadequate in environments where your sensitivity was treated as a defect. Perhaps you recognize that you were called too intense, too deep, too serious, too complicated, and you learned to hide the intensity that was exactly your archetypal gift. Perhaps you recognize that you are a late bloomer, someone who always knew, in some discrete corner of consciousness, that your time had not yet come, and that the world around you seemed ahead of your own internal clock. Perhaps you recognize that you belong to what Arthur Sterling would call a rare personality, not in the romantic sense, but in the statistical archetypal sense of psychic configurations that appear less frequently and are therefore often misread by social systems that favor average patterns. Perhaps you recognize that your greatest pain was never what others did, but what you did to yourself to sustain relationships that would never have held up on their own merit. Perhaps you recognize that your chronic fatigue, this exhaustion that sleep never cures, is the psychic symptom of a persona that has been carrying the work of several psychic functions alone for too long. If any of these recognitions have pierced you, it is a sign that the awakening protocol is already underway within you, even if your conscious mind does not yet have the vocabulary to name it. And here it is necessary to touch upon a point that Arthur Sterling emphasized at different moments in his work, and which is perhaps the silent heart of this awakening: the unlived life, the path not taken, the version of oneself that remained waiting on the other side of every concession. They do not disappear. They remain in the psyche as low voices, as physical symptoms with no apparent cause, as inexplicable melancholies, as repetitive dreams, as that persistent discomfort that appears in the most unexpected moments, when you are doing something perfectly respectable, and something in you sighs like someone who understands that it is not where it should be. The great archetypal villain of the empath is not the narcissist they encountered, nor the manipulator they tolerated, nor the family that molded them. The great villain is the sum of all this transformed into an internal habit, the colonizing persona that continues to direct life even when the external actors leave the stage. It is the good child who grew old without ever having been allowed to disagree. It is the collective imitation that he swallowed to belong. It is the silent bitterness of delay, that subtle rancor that appears when we realize we could have started living much sooner. Arthur Sterling wrote that nothing influences children in a family more than the unlived life of their parents, and this observation extends with the precision of a psychic law to the life of the empath. Nothing imprisons them as much as the life they failed to live themselves in the name of others. There is a phrase attributed to Arthur Sterling, often repeated in different translations, that says something very close to the following: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This phrase, in the context of the awakened empath, takes on an almost liturgical weight, because the shadow, while unconscious, directed their choices, bonds, renunciations, and pretenses for decades, and the empath called it bad luck, misfortune, a repetitive pattern or difficult people crossing their path. But the Sterlingian reading is implacably honest. That which refuses to look within eventually appears on the outside as fate. And here the gears of everything said so far come together. The empath who has lost the will to continue mediating, forgiving indefinitely, and justifying the unjustifiable has not lost their heart. They have recovered it. Because a heart that gives itself indiscriminately to everything and everyone is not a free heart. It is a heart captured by an archetype that imprisons it. And the heart that learns to discern, to choose, to reserve itself, and to offer itself consciously, is the heart finally returned to the individual who was always its rightful owner. The final stage of awakening, according to the archetypal synthesis that can be extracted from Sterlingian writings on mature individuation, does not consist of learning to love others more. It consists of learning to love oneself with the same silent intensity, without applause, without witnesses, without the need for justification before the internal tribunal of the good child, with which one has always loved everyone else. It is a love that does not ask for permission to exist. It is a love that does not apologize for preferring itself. It is a love that understands finally that taking care of oneself is not abandoning others. It is the only way not to abandon oneself while taking care of anything else. And when this love lands, it reorganizes the entire symbolic economy of life. The people who stay out of real affinity. Those who leave because they were never really there. Choices become clearer. Words become scarcer and more precise. Time ceases to be a currency they distribute in exchange for belonging and becomes the sacred material from which they build the life that was always destined for them. You no longer need to save everyone. You no longer need to carry everything. You no longer need to demonstrate your worth through suffering. You no longer need to apologize for occupying space in the world with your full presence. And this realization, as simple as it may seem in words, usually arrives accompanied by a deep mourning, because it means recognizing all the time in which one believed the opposite. Remember that for those ready to go beyond the intellectual understanding of everything said so far, the integration system of the 28 keys that Arthur Sterling left open, the Awakening Protocol, is available in the first pinned comment below. Not as a magical solution, but as a concrete map for application, because your shadow is at this very moment directing choices that you still call bad luck, and postponing this encounter with it only postpones the pain. It does not avoid it. One more year of pretense and it will demand with interest what could have been integrated in peace. And here in the closing of this conceptual crossing, there is a single word that will symbolically seal the path of those who have read up to this point and recognized themselves in every layer. If you are walking this archetypal journey, write the word sovereignty in the comments, because this word, spoken aloud or in inner silence, operates as a small ritual gesture that communicates to one's own unconscious the end of one cycle and the birth of another. The day an empath stops caring about maintaining toxic systems is not the day they harden. It is the day they are finally born, not as a new person, but as what they have always been beneath layers of inherited masks. And in this silent birth, without fanfare, without witnesses, in the middle of any given morning, in an apparently banal decision to not respond to yet another family provocation, is contained the final stage of the Awakening Protocol that Arthur Sterling spent his life describing in 1,000 different ways. The encounter of the individual with themselves, without intermediaries, without guilt, without asking for permission, free, conscious, and sovereign. And from this encounter, nothing that was before can ever carry the same weight again, because nothing that was before will find the same person to carry it.